Here's how to make this 8 by 16 checkerboard quilt block without cutting out a single square. Yes, that's right. It looks like it's squares, but you don't have to cut any. I used some leftover jelly roll strips, but you don't necessarily need a jelly roll. You just need two 2.5 by 42-inch strips, or 2.5 by the width of your fabric, which should be around 42 inches. First, I start by placing these two 2.5-inch strips right sides together and sew them with a 1/4-inch seam allowance all the way around the entire length of the strip. Once you have done that, you're going to want to press it to one direction. It does not matter which direction you press it in, just pick a way. I chose to do towards the darker fabric. And press it along the entire length of this 42-inch strip. Do as I say and not as I do, and make sure you're not like really ironing a lot and just pressing straight down. In my experience, I've found that these strips tend to warp a lot if you press around too much. Now fold this in half and just make a little press line in the middle. Open it up and we are going to cut right along this line. So we are cutting it in half. I didn't use a ruler here because it doesn't have to be perfectly cut in half, just straight enough. We do have a little extra room to work with. So now take your two strips and we're going to sew them together again. This time, make sure that they are alternating fabrics. So you'll see that the watermelon fabric is next to that like checkered fabric, and I had like a salvage end here that I just trimmed off. You can leave it if you really want or trim it later, whatever you want to do. Just like we did before, place these right sides together and sew with a 1/4-inch seam allowance along the entire length of the strip. Once you have done that, we can go ahead and open it up and press again. I press in the same direction that I have the other pieces pressed. And what you should have right now is 4 2.5-inch strips pieced together, and it should be like around 20 to 21 inches long. Now fold it in half one more time and make a quick press line that we are going to trim. Open it up, and I did use a ruler now just because it's a longer cut and I want it to be pretty straight, and go ahead and trim right along that halfway fold mark. Again, I have a little bit of a salvage end here that I'm going to trim away, and now we are going to sew these two together. Make sure you're doing opposite fabrics next to each other and sew along the length again, a 1/4 inch away from the edge, and we are going to press again in the same direction as the rest of your seams, and you should have like this long strip here. Should be 8 pieces now. And now we are going to cut it into 2.5-inch strips. First, I square off one of the ends. It's pretty straight, but I want it to be as straight as possible at this point. So I actually find the middle seam and make sure that's lining up on my ruler, and then just trim off the edges here so that it is squared up. Now I'm ready to flip it around and cut 4 2.5-inch strips. Go ahead and take a long ruler, line up the 2.5-inch mark on the edge, and cut your strips. You should have just a little bit left in the end, which is good. This gave us a little bit of room for error. And now you're going to put them in alternating directions. So you'll see I take the second one here and flip it, and then the fourth one and flip it, so that the squares are not the same like color pattern right next to each other. And then I put 2 on top of 1 and 4 on top of 3. And since we pressed them all in the same direction before, they should be in alternating directions for these strips because we flipped the 2 around. So you can easily nest your seams and sew 1/4 inch from the edge, putting these 2 halves together. So now we should have 2 pieces that look like this. And I don't press at this point, but you could, if you wanted, press the seams open on the back and then put these 2 halves together. Make sure again that you are doing like alternating patterns so that they are not the same right next to each other. Your seams should nest again really nicely. And then I do a little back stitch when I'm putting together these rows. And then I go ahead and press my seams open, and that is it. That is how I make this rectangular block. And if you wanted to make a square one instead, all you would have to do is skip the step where we folded in half a second time and just cut your 2.5-inch strips at that point. This is perfect for when you have leftover jelly roll strips and maybe you want to make like a little zipper bag, or follow along for my Learn to Quilt series that I am bringing back a new pattern that will involve this block on February 1st.